Hello everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. The thing about Denali is that it doesn't forgive mistakes. Ask any seasoned hiker, and they'll tell you the same thing. Respect the mountain, or it'll swallow you whole. But what happened to the Richardson expedition in October 2019 wasn't about mistakes. It was something else, entirely. Mark Richardson had been leading wilderness expeditions for 15 years. His team that day consisted of 3 experienced hikers: Sarah Chen, a wildlife photographer from Seattle; Jake Morrison, a former Army Ranger turned outdoor guide; and Lisa Vance, a geologist studying permafrost patterns. They weren't weekend warriors. These people knew the wilderness like their own backyard. The plan was simple: establish base camp at mile marker 7 along the Savage River Trail, document wildlife movements for Sarah's upcoming exhibition, and return within 72 hours. The weather forecast showed clear skies, temperatures hovering around 28 degrees, perfect conditions for late-season camping. But Alaska has a way of changing its mind. They set up camp as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks. Mark still remembers the methodical way they arranged their gear: the Coleman stove positioned away from the tent walls, bear canisters secured exactly 50 yards downwind, emergency beacon tested twice before darkness fell. Everything by the book. Sarah was adjusting her telephoto lens when she first heard it. A voice, distant but unmistakably human, calling her name from somewhere deep in the tree line. Sarah, Sarah. The sound carried on the wind like an echo, but there was no source. No other campers registered for that section of the park. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, lowering her camera. The others paused their evening routine, listening. Nothing but wind through the spruce trees and the distant crack of settling ice. Jake shrugged it off. "Sound travels weird up here. Probably just wind through the rocks." But Mark noticed how his hand instinctively moved toward the bear spray on his belt. As full darkness settled over their camp, the temperature dropped faster than expected. The clear skies they'd been promised gave way to a low, heavy overcast that seemed to press down on them like a living thing. By 9 p.m., their thermometer read 14 degrees, nearly 15 degrees colder than forecast. That's when the voices started, in earnest. Mark, where are you?" The voice was Lisa's, but Lisa was sitting right there beside the camp stove, her face pale in the flickering light. She looked around at the others, confusion written across her features. "That wasn't me," she whispered. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Mark, help me. I'm lost." It was definitely Lisa's voice, the slight California accent, the way she drew out vowels when she was scared. But Lisa's mouth hadn't moved. Jake stood up, his military training kicking in. "Everyone stays together. No one leaves this camp for any reason." His voice was steady, but Mark caught the slight tremor underneath. Even rangers get spooked. For the next hour, they took turns hearing their own names called from the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Sarah's voice pleading for help from the north, Jake's voice laughing from somewhere to the east, a sound that made their skin crawl, because Jake wasn't laughing. He was sitting rigid, staring into the black tree line with the intensity of a guard dog. The forest felt alive around them, breathing and watching. Every snapping twig became a footstep. Every whisper of wind became a voice just beyond comprehension. Lisa pulled out the emergency satellite communicator, but the device showed no signal. Impossible at their elevation with clear line of sight to the southern sky. At 11:47 p.m., according to Mark's GPS log, Jake stood up abruptly. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the firelight, something the others couldn't see. "There," he said quietly. "There's someone out there." And then he walked into the darkness. They called after him, his real name, not the mimicking voices they'd been hearing. But Jake kept walking, with the steady, purposeful gait of someone following a familiar path. The beam of his headlamp bobbed through the trees, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely behind a ridge. Sarah wanted to follow, but Mark grabbed her arm. "We wait until morning," he said, though his instincts screamed to go after their friend. "We wait for daylight." They didn't sleep. How could they? The voices continued throughout the night, Jake's voice now joining the chorus, calling back to them from impossible directions. Sometimes he sounded close enough to touch, sometimes his voice echoed from miles away. But when dawn finally broke gray and cold over Denali, there was no sign of him anywhere. The search lasted 3 days. Park rangers, search and rescue teams, even helicopter crews combed every square mile within a 10-mile radius of their camp. They found Jake's headlamp hanging from a branch 12 miles north. Impossible to reach in the time he had been gone. Impossible terrain to cross in darkness. But there were no footprints in the snow beneath it. No tracks leading to it or away from it. Jake Morrison simply vanished. Mark, Sarah, and Lisa were evacuated by helicopter that afternoon. The official report classified it as a hiking accident, disorientation, hypothermia, a tragic but explainable disappearance in unforgiving terrain. Case closed. But Mark still wakes up some nights, hearing Jake's voice calling his name from outside his bedroom window in suburban Anchorage. Sarah stopped taking wilderness photography assignments. And Lisa? Well, she moved to Florida, as far from Alaska's mountains as she could get. Because they all know the truth that didn't make it into any official report. In Denali, when the mountain calls your name, it's not asking, it's claiming. And somewhere in those endless peaks and valleys, Jake Morrison is still walking, still following something deeper into the wilderness, adding his voice to the chorus that waits for the next group of campers foolish enough to think they understand Alaska's rules. The mountain always gets what it wants. Always.
The Yukon River doesn't sleep. It flows through Alaska like a massive artery, carrying the lifeblood of the territory for over 1,900 miles. But along its banks, in the tiny village of Eagle, population 87, the river carries something else. Voices of the dead, whispering secrets that drive man mad. Tommy Nikolai had fished these waters his entire life. 43 years of casting nets and checking salmon runs. 43 years of reading the river's moods like pages in a familiar book. His grandfather had taught him that the Yukon was alive, that it remembered every soul it had claimed over the centuries. Tommy thought it was just old Athabascan folklore, until the night his brother David started calling to him from beneath the ice. David had died 3 winters prior, drunk and disoriented, stumbling through a January blizzard. They found his body in spring when the ice broke up, his frozen form tangled in driftwood near the old fish wheel. Tommy identified the remains himself, his brother's wedding ring, the scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. David was buried in Eagle's small cemetery, 20 yards from the river that killed him. But the dead don't always stay buried in Alaska. It started on a Tuesday night in late September. Tommy was running his nets by moonlight, the way his father and grandfather had done before him. The salmon run was thin that year. Climate change and overfishing had reduced the mighty Yukon to a shadow of its former abundance. But fishing was all Tommy knew, all his family had ever known. The river was unusually quiet that night. No lapping of water against his aluminum boat, no splash of jumping fish. Even the wind had died to nothing, leaving the surface smooth as black glass. Tommy remembers thinking how strange it was. The Yukon was never that still, never that silent. That's when he heard the voice. "Tommy, Tommy, help me." The words drifted across the water like fog, so faint he almost convinced himself it was imagination. But there it was again, clearer this time. "Tommy, I'm stuck. I can't get out." The voice was David's. Not similar to David's, not reminiscent of his dead brother. It was absolutely unmistakably David's voice, carrying the same slight stutter he'd had since childhood, the same way of drawing out the O in Tommy's name. Tommy's hands trembled as he shipped his oars. "David? he called into the darkness. "David, is that you?" Silence. Then, from somewhere downstream, "Help me, Tommy. I'm so cold. I can't feel my hands." Every rational part of Tommy's mind screamed that this was impossible. David was 3 years dead, buried under 6 feet of permafrost. But the voice, oh God, the voice was so real, so desperate. It was his little brother, trapped and afraid, just like when they were kids and David would get stuck in the old mine shaft behind their house. Tommy started the outboard motor, its puttering echo bouncing off the water like gunshots. He followed the voice downstream, past the fishwheel ruins, past the old trading post, past markers he'd known his entire life. The voice led him on, always just ahead, always just out of reach. "This way, Tommy. I can see you now. I'm right here." The shoreline looked different in the moonlight. Trees he didn't recognize, rock formations that seemed wrong somehow. But Tommy pressed on, guided by his brother's voice calling from the darkness ahead. "Almost there, Tommy. Just a little further." The water began to feel strange beneath his boat. Thick, viscous, like oil rather than river water. His motor started to sputter, then died completely, leaving him drifting in the unnatural silence. That's when he realized he could see the bottom of the river, despite being in water that should have been 20 feet deep. And there, staring up at him through the clear water, were faces. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, men and women and children, all looking up with wide, pleading eyes. Their mouths moved in silent screams. Their hands reached toward the surface, but they remained trapped beneath the water, held down by something Tommy couldn't see. David's face was among them, younger than when he died, wearing the same confused expression he'd had as a child when he couldn't understand why adults made such complicated rules about simple things. "David, come down here. David, David, come down here and help us. We can't get out." The boat began to sink, though there were no holes in the hull, no explanation for why water was suddenly pouring in from all sides. Tommy grabbed for his life jacket, but his hands passed through it like it was made of smoke. Everything in the boat, his nets, his tackle box, his emergency radio, became insubstantial, ghostly. Only the voices remained real. David's voice, joined now by others. "Stay with us, Tommy. Stay forever." Tommy did the only thing he could think of. He jumped. The shock of hitting the water broke whatever spell had been cast. Suddenly, he was in the regular Yukon again, 20 yards from shore, his boat nowhere to be seen. The water was freezing, moving fast, trying to drag him downstream toward the rapids. But it was real water now, normal water, and Tommy Nikolai had been swimming these currents since he was 5 years old. He made it to shore just as hypothermia began to set in, crawling up the muddy bank more dead than alive. The villagers found him at dawn, raving about voices and faces in the water. They got him to the clinic, warmed him up, convinced him he'd had some kind of breakdown. Too much grief, too much isolation, too much time alone by the river. But Tommy knew better. He never fished at night again, never went near the water after dark, because he understood now what his grandfather had tried to tell him. The Yukon remembers everyone it takes, and sometimes, when the conditions are just right, the dead get lonely enough to go fishing for the living. David's voice still calls to him sometimes, drifting up from storm drains and sink pipes, anywhere water flows in the darkness. But Tommy doesn't answer anymore. He can't, because he knows that if he follows that voice again, if he goes back to the river that spoke his name, he'll join the faces looking up from the bottom, waiting for the next fisherman, foolish enough to cast his nets in cursed waters. There's an unwritten rule in Alaska's backcountry. If you find an unlocked cabin during a storm, you use it, but you leave it better than you found it. Stock the firewood, replace what you consume, and always, always respect the ghosts. Because every remote cabin has them, and most of the time, they're content to share the space. Most of the time. Frank Kowalski learned about the exception during the blizzard of November 2018 when he stumbled half-frozen through the door of a cabin that shouldn't have existed, in a location that wasn't marked on any map he'd ever seen. Frank was a hunting guide from Fairbanks, tough as winter nails and twice as sharp. He'd been tracking a wounded moose for 6 hours when the storm hit, one of those sudden, vicious Alaska blizzards that turns day into night and familiar terrain into an alien landscape. Visibility dropped to 0 in minutes, and the temperature plummeted to 20 below faster than his GPS could track. He'd been following what he thought was a game trail when he saw the light, a warm golden glow filtering through the trees like a beacon. No hunter travels without emergency shelter knowledge, and Frank knew he had maybe 30 minutes before frostbite set in permanently. The light was salvation. The cabin materialized out of the swirling snow like something from a dream. Log construction, solid and well-maintained, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and lamplight spilling from frost-covered windows. Even more miraculous, the door was unlocked, swinging open at his touch as if the cabin itself was welcoming him inside. The interior was immaculate. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with preserved food, hunting gear, and thick wool blankets. The air smelled of cedar smoke and coffee, as if someone had just stepped out for firewood and would return any minute. But there were no fresh tracks in the snow outside, no sign that anyone had been there in weeks. Frank didn't question his luck. Hypothermia was already setting in. His fingers fumbled with his gear, and his thoughts moved like cold honey. He stripped off his frozen outer layers, wrapped himself in blankets, and settled by the fire with profound gratitude. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin, he was safe. That's when he noticed the carvings. They covered every wall, names and dates etched deep into the log walls with what looked like hunting knives. J. Peterson, December 1987. Mary Chen, January 1993. Rick Morrison, November 2001. Dozens of names, maybe hundreds, all followed by winter dates stretching back over 30 years. He assumed they were visitors like himself, hunters and hikers who'd found shelter in this remote sanctuary. But as he studied the carvings more closely, patterns emerged that made his blood run cold. The dates were too specific, too final. Tom Bradley, December 15th, 1989, last day. Sarah Kim, February 3rd, 1995. Couldn't leave. More disturbing were the messages carved beneath some names. It won't let me go. The door won't open. Something lives under the floor. Frank tried the door. It opened easily, revealing the raging blizzard beyond. He could leave any time he wanted. So what had these people meant? As night deepened, the cabin began to feel different. The fire never seemed to need more wood, yet Frank never saw anyone tend it. The coffee pot stayed warm without being on the stove. And there were sounds, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Footsteps in the loft above, though the latter showed no recent use. The creak of floorboards in the kitchen when Frank was sitting by the fire. Around midnight, he heard scratching from beneath the cabin. It started soft, like mice in the walls, but gradually grew more insistent. Long, deliberate scratches, as if something with claws was carving words into the underside of the floorboards. Frank pressed his ear to the floor and heard it clearly, the methodical scrape of something sharp against wood, working with purpose and intelligence. Then came the voice. "Let me out!" The words were muffled by wood and earth, but unmistakably human. "I've been down here so long! Let me out!" Frank jumped back from the floor as if it had burned him. The voice continued, pleading, desperate. "I know you're there! I can hear you walking around. Just lift the floorboards. Please, I'm so cold down here." Every instinct told Frank to run, but the blizzard still raged outside, certain death in the darkness and cold. He was trapped between the howling wilderness and whatever lived beneath the cabin floorboards.
The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Frank could feel vibrations through his boots as something clawed at the wood beneath his feet. Other voices joined the first one. Men, women, children, all begging to be released from whatever prison lies under the cabin. "We've been waiting so long," they pleaded. "Just move the boards. Just let us up. We won't hurt you." But Frank noticed something that chilled him more than their desperate pleas. The voices were coming from directly beneath the name carvings on the walls. Each carved name corresponded to a voice below, as if the people who'd sheltered in this cabin had never really left. They'd simply moved from above the floorboards to below them. He spent the rest of the night pressed against the door, ready to flee into the storm if necessary. The voices continued until dawn, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, sometimes singing lullabies in languages he didn't recognize. Through it all, he could hear the methodical scratching, as if dozens of hands were slowly, patiently wearing away at the wood that held them down. When morning finally broke and the storm cleared, Frank burst out of the cabin like a man escaping hell. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck, and he didn't stop driving until he was back in Fairbanks, surrounded by electric lights and paved roads and the comfortable sounds of civilization. The authorities found his story interesting but not unprecedented. Alaska was full of remote cabins that played tricks on storm-addled minds. Isolation, hypothermia, and stress could make anyone hear voices. They sent a team to investigate based on Frank's GPS coordinates, but they found nothing. No cabin, no clearing, just virgin wilderness that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Frank never hunted alone again, and sometimes, on particularly cold nights when the wind howls just right, he still hears them, the voices from beneath the floorboards, calling his name, begging him to come back and lift the boards and join them in whatever dark space lies between the cabin and the frozen ground below. Because in Alaska, some shelters don't save you from the wilderness, they save the wilderness from you. And somewhere in the trackless forest, a cabin waits with its fire always burning and its door always open, ready to add another name to the walls and another voice to the chorus that scratches eternally at the floorboards, trying to claw their way back to the world above.
The northern lights are supposed to be beautiful. Ethereal curtains of green and gold dancing across Alaska's winter sky, a natural wonder that draws photographers and tourists from around the world. But seasoned Alaskans know better. They know that sometimes, when the aurora burns too bright and moves too purposefully across the darkness, you shouldn't look too long. Because the lights don't just illuminate the night, they reveal things that were meant to stay hidden. Marcus Chen learned this truth during his final photography expedition to the Chugach Mountains in March 2020, when he captured images that should never have existed and saw figures that still visit him in dreams. Marcus was a National Geographic photographer, specializing in Arctic phenomena. He'd spent 5 years documenting climate change across Alaska, but the Aurora project was personal, a tribute to his grandmother, who told him stories about the lights carrying messages from the dead. She'd been Tlingit, descended from generations who understood that the aurora wasn't just electromagnetic particles colliding with atmosphere. It was something older, something that remembered. The forecast that March showed perfect conditions for aurora photography: clear skies, new moon, and high solar activity that promised spectacular displays. Marcus loaded his truck with camera equipment, cold weather gear, and enough supplies for 3 days alone in the wilderness. His destination was a remote clearing at 3,000 feet elevation, accessible only by snowshoe, where light pollution couldn't dilute the sky's natural theater. He established camp as twilight settled over the mountains, his breath forming ice crystals in the -15 air. The setup was routine: tripod secured against wind, camera batteries kept warm against his body, intervalometer programmed for long exposures. He'd done this hundreds of times before, but something felt different about this night. The silence was too complete, the darkness too deep, as if the mountains were holding their breath. The aurora began around 10 p.m., starting as a faint green glow on the northern horizon. Marcus adjusted his camera settings and began shooting, watching through his viewfinder as the lights slowly intensified. At first, everything was normal. The familiar dance of luminescence across the star-filled sky, beautiful and predictable. But around midnight, the aurora changed.
Instead of the usual flowing ribbons, the lights began forming shapes, geometric patterns too precise to be natural, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Marcus lowered his camera and stared at the sky with naked eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. The aurora was writing something across the darkness, letters in a language that seemed familiar, yet impossible to read. He raised his camera again and continued shooting, driven by professional instinct, even as unease crept up his spine. Through the viewfinder, he could see the lights more clearly, and that's when he noticed them, dark silhouettes moving against the luminous background. At first, Marcus thought they were birds, perhaps ravens disturbed by the unusual aurora activity. But the shapes were wrong, too tall, too angular, moving with a purposeful intelligence that no bird possessed. They stood perfectly still against the dancing lights, dozens of them, arranged across the sky like an audience watching a performance. Marcus adjusted his telephoto lens and zoomed in. What he saw through the camera made his hand shake so violently he nearly dropped the equipment. The figures weren't birds or atmospheric distortions. They were people, or things that had once been people. Human silhouettes stretched impossibly tall, standing on what appeared to be solid ground despite being suspended hundreds of feet in the air. They faced his direction with perfect uniformity, their attention focused entirely on him. Every time Marcus lowered his camera, the sky looked normal, just aurora lights dancing across empty darkness. But when he looked through the viewfinder, they were there, watching, waiting. More appeared with each photograph, emerging from the lights like shadows stepping out of a movie screen. The aurora grew brighter, more intense, until the entire sky blazed with unnatural radiance. The figures began to move, not flowing with the lights, but walking through them, descending slowly toward the earth. Marcus could see details now that made his rational mind rebel. Their elongated limbs, their eyeless faces, the way they moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, as if remembering how human locomotion worked. He should have packed up and left. Every survival instinct screamed at him to abandon his equipment and flee down the mountain. But Marcus was a photographer first, and he'd never seen anything like this. He kept shooting, documenting the impossible, even as the figures drew closer to the tree line. The aurora began to pulse with rhythm, like a massive heartbeat visible across the sky. With each pulse, the figures took another step downward, and Marcus realized they weren't descending randomly. They were heading directly to his camp. His camera's memory card filled with hundreds of images, the aurora forming symbols, the figures walking through light, and in the final shots, dozens of elongated shadows standing in his camp after he had fled. Marcus packed his gear with trembling hands, not bothering with his usual careful procedures. The aurora continued its impossible display, and the figures remained motionless at the edge of his vision, watching him break camp with what felt like patient amusement. He made it back to his truck by dawn, driving through the mountain pass without stopping, without looking back, without acknowledging what he had witnessed. It wasn't until he reached Anchorage and developed his photographs that the full horror became clear. The images showed everything: the aurora forming symbols, the figures descending from the sky, and in the final photograph, dozens of elongated shadows standing in his camp after he had fled. But most disturbing was the last image on the memory card, a photo he didn't remember taking, a close-up of his own face, eyes wide with terror, with dozens of dark figures visible in the reflection of his pupils. Marcus never published the Aurora Project. The images were too impossible, too fundamentally wrong to share with the world. He locked them away and tried to forget, but the figures hadn't forgotten him. They visit him now whenever aurora activity peaks over Anchorage. He sees them in his apartment windows, reflected in mirrors, standing motionless in the corners of photographs he takes for other projects. They don't threaten or communicate. They simply watch, patient and eternal, waiting for him to return to the mountains where the lights dance and the forgotten walk among the stars. Because Marcus learned what his grandmother tried to tell him. The aurora doesn't just carry messages from the dead. Sometimes it carries the dead themselves, and once they've seen you clearly, once you've photographed their impossible existence, you become part of their eternal audience,
forever marked by the light that reveals too much.
The Trans-Alaska Pipeline stretches 800 miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, carrying oil from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, through wilderness that would kill you just for looking at it wrong. For 47 years, it's been Alaska's steel lifeline, pumping black gold through a landscape that doesn't want it there. But in 1977, during the pipeline's first winter of operation, maintenance crews discovered that oil wasn't the only thing flowing through those pipes. Eddie Kowalczyk was a welder from Pittsburgh, part of the crew tasked with monitoring the pipeline's integrity during its inaugural season. The work was brutal, 12-hour shifts in -40 temperatures, checking joints and pressure readings along hundreds of miles of pipe that snaked across tundra like a massive steel serpent. But the pay was incredible, and Eddie had a family to feed back home. The incident happened at Pump Station 3, roughly 180 miles north of Fairbanks, where the pipeline crossed a particularly desolate stretch of tundra. Eddie and his partner, Roy Hutchins, were conducting routine maintenance on a section that had been showing minor pressure fluctuations. Nothing dramatic, just enough variance to warrant a physical inspection. They were working by floodlight in the endless Arctic night when Roy first heard it, scratching from inside the pipe. Not the normal sounds of oil flow or thermal expansion, but something deliberate, rhythmic, like claws against metal. "You hear that?" Roy asked, pressing his ear against the warm steel. The pipeline ran above ground in this section, supported by thermosiphons to prevent permafrost melt, making it easy to access for inspection. Eddie listened. At first, just the usual sounds, the subtle vibration of fluid movement, the occasional ping of metal adjusting to temperature changes. Then he heard it too. Scratch, 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 coming from deep inside the pipe, traveling against the flow of oil. Probably debris, Eddie said, though his voice lacked conviction. Maybe ice buildup at a weld joint, but Roy was already shaking his head. Ice doesn't move like that. Ice doesn't travel. They followed the sound along the pipeline for nearly a quarter mile, the scratching always staying just ahead of them, as if whatever was making the noise could sense their approach. When they stopped, it stopped. When they moved, it moved. The pattern was too intelligent to be random debris, too purposeful to be natural. Roy suggested they open an inspection port to look inside, but Eddie balked. You didn't breach pipeline integrity without authorization, without backup, without a dozen safety protocols in place. The oil inside was under enormous pressure. One wrong move could create a catastrophic spill or worse. But the scratching continued, growing more insistent as the night wore on. Other sounds joined it, a wet, sliding noise, like something large moving through liquid, and underneath it all, barely audible, what sounded almost like breathing. "We need to radio this in," Eddie said, but when he tried his radio, he got only static. The repeater stations should have provided clear communication across the entire pipeline route, but something was interfering with the signal. That's when they saw the eyes. At the next inspection port, a small window designed for visual monitoring of oil flow, something pressed against the glass from inside. In the beam of their flashlights, they glimpsed a pale, bulbous shape with what looked like dozens of small black eyes arranged in no pattern found in nature. The thing pulsed against the window, leaving smears of something that wasn't oil on the glass. Roy stumbled backward, his wrench clattering onto the frozen ground. "Jesus Christ, what is that thing?" Eddie stared into those impossible eyes and felt something deep in his brain recoil, a primal recognition that he was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that had found its way into humanity's veins and was now traveling toward civilization with malevolent purpose. The thing in the pipe began moving again, flowing with the oil, but somehow independent of it, following the pipeline's route southward. Eddie and Roy tracked it for hours, watching through inspection ports as the pale mass undulated through the steel arteries, occasionally pressing against the walls with appendages they couldn't quite comprehend. As dawn approached, or what passed for dawn in the Arctic winter, they reached Pump Station 4, where the pipeline crossed a major access road. Other maintenance crews would arrive soon for the morning shift. Eddie knew they had to stop it before that thing, whatever it was, reached populated areas. "We have to stop it," Eddie told Roy. "Cut the flow, isolate the section, figure out what we're dealing with." Roy nodded, his face gray with exhaustion and fear. They initiated an emergency shutdown of the affected pipeline section, a procedure that would drain oil into containment units for inspection. It was a career-ending decision without proper authorization, but some things mattered more than protocol. The drainage took 6 hours. When they finally opened the inspection hatch, expecting to find the creature trapped in the residual oil, they discovered something worse. The pipe was completely clean, as if nothing had ever flowed through it except air. No oil residue, no debris, no evidence of the thing they'd tracked for miles through the steel veins of Alaska's most critical infrastructure. But pressed into the metal walls, as if burned by acid, were dozens of handprint-like marks. If hands had too many fingers and joints that bent in impossible directions. The official report classified the incident as equipment malfunction and worker fatigue. Eddie and Roy were quietly transferred to other projects, their testimonies buried in classified files. The pipeline resumed operation the next day, carrying oil south toward refineries and population centers. But Eddie never forgot what he saw in those pipes. And he wasn't the only one. Over the years, other maintenance crews reported similar encounters. Glimpses of something pale and wrong moving through the pipeline, always heading south, always just beyond the reach of cameras or proper documentation. The thing in the pipeline is still there, according to whispered conversations among workers who've learned not to file official reports. It travels the steel arteries of Alaska like some kind of industrial parasite, patient and purposeful, using humanity's own infrastructure to reach destinations unknown. And sometimes, late at night when oil pressure drops unexpectedly, when pumps struggle for reasons engineers can't explain, maintenance crews hear scratching in the pipes and know that something ancient and hungry is still traveling through Alaska's veins, carried by black oil toward a civilization that has no idea what's coming through its lifelines in the darkness below.
In rural Alaska, villages disappear sometimes. Not gradually, not due to economic decline or natural disaster, but suddenly, as if an entire community simply decided to walk away from their lives in the middle of an ordinary day. The official explanations vary: mass relocation, environmental hazards, communication breakdowns. But Sarah Koenig knows the truth about what happened to Anaktuvuk and why some places are better left empty. Sarah was a teacher with the Alaska Department of Education, assigned to provide supplemental instruction for remote villages where regular staffing proved impossible. It was challenging work, flying between settlements accessible only by bush plane, adapting curriculum to communities where traditional ways of life still held stronger than state requirements. But Sarah loved it, found purpose in connecting isolated children with the broader world of knowledge. Anaktuvuk was her final assignment of the 2019 school year, a small Inupiat village of 43 residents nestled in the Brooks Range, 200 miles from the nearest road. The community subsisted on hunting, fishing, and seasonal tourism, maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries while slowly adapting to modern necessities like satellite internet and solar power. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday in late October, flying in on a chartered Cessna that would return for her the following Monday. 5 days to assess the village's educational needs and establish distance learning protocols for the winter months ahead. The pilot, Jim Nakamura, had been making supply runs to Anaktuvuk for 15 years and knew every family by name. "Quiet bunch lately?" he mentioned as they circled the village for landing. "Radio check-ins have been spotty for weeks. Probably just equipment problems." From the air, Anaktuvuk looked perfectly normal. smoke rising from chimneys, snowmobiles parked outside homes, children's sleds scattered in yards. But as they taxied to the small gravel strip that served as the village's airport, Sarah noticed an odd stillness to the scene, as if she were looking at a photograph rather than a living community. The village coordinator, Mary Tutu, was supposed to meet Sarah's plane, but no one appeared as she unloaded her bags. Jim seemed unconcerned. Schedules ran differently in Bush, Alaska, and weather often delayed planned meetings by hours or days. He helped Sarah carry her supplies to the village school, promised to check radio contact from Fairbanks, and took off into the overcast sky. Sarah found the school unlocked, which was unusual in communities where crime was virtually non-existent. The building was clean and well-maintained, with student artwork decorating the walls and lesson plans laid out on desks as if teachers had just stepped out for lunch. But the coffee in the pot was stone cold, and a thin layer of dust covered everything, not days' worth, but enough to suggest the building had been empty longer than expected. She walked through the village, looking for Mary or any of the 43 residents she was scheduled to meet. Front doors stood unlocked, windows glowed with electric light, and meals sat half-finished on kitchen tables, as if families had stepped away mid-bite and simply never returned. In the Tutu house, Sarah found pancakes still on the griddle, syrup congealed, but plates and silverware arranged for 4 people. Coffee cups sat full and untouched. A child's backpack lay open on the floor. Homework spilled out as if dropped in haste. But there were no signs of struggle, no indication of danger or emergency evacuation. House after house revealed the same pattern. Lives interrupted in the middle of ordinary moments, but no evidence of where the people had gone. Beds were unmade, as if residents had risen normally that morning. Food was out, as if they'd been preparing breakfast when something called them away. But there were no footprints in the snow leading away from the village, no tire tracks or snowmobile trails indicating mass departure. As darkness fell, true Arctic darkness that comes early and stays late, Sarah barricaded herself in the school building, trying to rationalize what she'd found. Maybe the entire village had gone hunting together or traveled to another settlement for a community gathering. Remote Alaska operated by different rules, different social patterns that outsiders didn't always understand. But deep down, she knew something was fundamentally wrong with Inuktitut. Around midnight, Sarah heard the footsteps. They came from outside the school, circling the building with methodical precision. Not the random wandering of lost villagers, but a coordinated movement that suggested purpose and intelligence. Through the windows, she could see shapes moving in the darkness. Dozens of figures walking in perfect formation around the school, around and around in an endless loop. Sarah called out, identifying herself as the visiting teacher, explaining that she'd been looking for them all day. The figures stopped moving, but no one answered. In the silence that followed, she could hear breathing, not the natural rhythm of living humans, but something mechanical, synchronized, like a recorded sound played on repeat. She pressed her face to the window and tried to make out details in the darkness. The figures appeared to be the missing villagers. She recognized Mary's distinctive parka, saw the red snow boots that belonged to one of the children she was supposed to teach, but they stood too still, moved too uniformly, as if they'd forgotten how individual human motion worked. The circling continued until dawn, when the figures simply melted away into the landscape, leaving Sarah alone with questions that had no rational answers. When Jim's plane returned that afternoon, she was packed and waiting at the airstrip, desperate to leave Inuktitut behind. "Find everyone okay?" Jim asked as they lifted off. Sarah looked down at the village one last time. Smoke rose from chimneys, lights glowed in windows, and everything appeared normal from the air. But she knew better now, knew that the village was empty, that whatever walked those streets at night wasn't the community that once lived there. The official investigation found no evidence of foul play. The villagers' personal belongings remained untouched, Their bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and aerial searches revealed no signs of mass migration. Anaktavuk was classified as abandoned, its residents listed as missing persons in a case that remains active but inactive. But Sarah knows they didn't leave. She knows they're still there, walking in circles through their empty homes, going through the motions of lives they no longer remember how to live. Because sometimes in Alaska, entire communities don't disappear, they transform into something else, something that wears the shape of humanity while forgetting what it means to be human. And on clear nights, bush pilots flying over the Brooks Range still report seeing lights in Anaktavuk, smoke from chimneys, signs of life in a village that's supposed to be empty. But none of them ever land to investigate, because they understand what Sarah learned that October night. Some places are too quiet, too still, too perfectly preserved to be safe for the living.
In Alaska, bears are facts of life. Black bears, brown bears, polar bears. Each species demands respect and understanding from anyone venturing into the wilderness. Every Alaskan learns the rules. Make noise, carry spray, never run from a grizzly unless you want to trigger its chase instinct. But there are things in Alaska's forests that look like bears, move like bears, and hunt like bears, while being something altogether different, something that doesn't follow any rules in the wildlife manual. The Hendricks hunting party learned this truth during their annual caribou expedition in September 2021, when they encountered a predator that defied everything they thought they knew about Alaska's wildlife. Pete Hendricks had been guiding hunting expeditions for 23 years, leading clients through the remote wilderness of the Alaska Range, where caribou migration routes offered some of the best hunting in North America. His team that week consisted of 3 experienced hunters from the lower 48, Dr. Michael Santos, a surgeon from Denver, James Crawford, a retired police detective from Memphis, and Tony Ricci, a construction contractor from Boston. These weren't weekend warriors. Each man had decades of hunting experience across multiple states, and they'd hunted with Pete before. They knew the dangers of Alaska wilderness, understood bear behavior, and carried appropriate deterrence. But what stalked their camp wasn't interested in following the behavioral patterns of any known species. They'd established base camp in a valley 30 miles southeast of Denali, accessible only by helicopter and surrounded by pristine wilderness. The caribou were running late that year. Climate change had disrupted traditional migration patterns, but Pete's decades of experience suggested the herd would pass through within days. The first sign of trouble came on their second night, when something large circled their camp in the darkness beyond their firelight. Through their thermal scope, Pete glimpsed what appeared to be a massive brown bear, easily 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. But the movement was wrong, too fluid, too purposeful, as if the creature was studying them rather than simply investigating unfamiliar scents. "Big bastard," whispered Crawford, who dealt with dangerous animals during his police career. "Must be 1,300 pounds. Pete nodded, but something about the bear's behavior bothered him. Grizzlies were curious, but typically cautious around human camps, especially ones with proper food storage and bright lights. This one moved with predatory confidence, circling closer with each pass, showing no fear of their presence. They secured their camp according to standard protocols: bear canisters 50 yards downwind, rifles within arm's reach, pepper spray ready. But the creature continued its surveillance throughout the night, occasionally visible at the edge of their thermal vision, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear in a completely different location with impossible speed. The second day brought scattered caribou sightings, but no clear shots. More concerning was the evidence they found around their camp:
massive paw prints in the soft earth, but the spacing was wrong for a quadruped. The stride length suggested something that alternated between four-legged and bipedal locomotion, covering ground with a gait no known bear species possessed. Dr. Santos, who had some background in veterinary medicine, studied the tracks with growing unease. He said, "These prints are too deep for the soil conditions. Whatever made these weighs more than any bear should. And look at these claw marks. They're not curved like a bear's. They're straight, almost like fingers." That evening, the creature returned with bolder behavior. It approached within 50 feet of their fire, allowing them clear visual contact for the first time. What they saw challenged every assumption about Alaska's wildlife. The thing was enormous, larger than any grizzly on record, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too angular, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its massive torso. Its fur was the right color for a brown bear, but the texture appeared coarse, almost artificial. Most disturbing were its eyes, which reflected their firelight with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "That's not a bear," whispered Ricci, his rifle trained on the creature. "Look at how it's watching us. Look at its face." The creature's facial features were a grotesque mixture of ursine and something else. The broad snout of a bear, but with a more pronounced brow ridge and jaw structure that seemed designed for different prey than a normal bear would hunt. When it opened its mouth, they glimpsed teeth that were too sharp, arranged in patterns that belonged to no species in any wildlife guide. Pete had been guiding in Alaska long enough to trust his instincts, and every instinct screamed that this thing was wrong. He'd seen thousands of bears, understood their behavior patterns, could predict their actions with reasonable accuracy. But this creature moved with deliberate malevolence, studying them the way a human might study insects before pulling off their wings. The confrontation came on their third night, when Tony Ricci stepped outside the tent to relieve himself and found the creature waiting 20 feet away, standing upright like a man, but towering 9 feet tall. Its massive arms hung at its sides, and in the moonlight, its face wore what could only be described as a smile. Ricci screamed and dove back toward the tent as the thing lunged forward with inhuman speed. Pete and Crawford opened fire simultaneously, their rifle reports echoing across the valley like thunder. Both men were excellent marksmen. Both hit center mass, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. The creature absorbed the impacts without slowing, closing the distance to their camp with terrifying grace. Dr. Santos grabbed the flare gun and fired directly into its chest. The magnesium flare exploded against its torso, illuminating the creature in brilliant white light. For a moment, they saw it clearly. Not a bear at all, but something wearing the approximate shape of a bear, like an ill-fitting costume. Its fur was patchy and wrong, its limbs jointed in places where no joints should exist, and its face a nightmare fusion of animal and something far worse. The creature paused, examining the burning flare embedded in its chest with what appeared to be curiosity rather than pain. Then it looked directly at Pete with eyes that held far too much intelligence, opened its mouth to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth, and made a sound that was half roar, half laughter. Then it simply walked away, disappearing into the darkness as if the encounter had been a game that no longer interested it. The helicopter evacuation came 12 hours early, summoned by Pete's emergency beacon. The official report classified the incident as a bear encounter with no injuries, but all 4 men knew they'd faced something that bear hunting couldn't prepare them for. Pete never guided in that area again. The others gave up hunting entirely,
unable to shake the memory of those two intelligent eyes and that terrible laugh, because they understood now that Alaska's wilderness holds predators that don't appear in any field guide, creatures that wear familiar shapes while being fundamentally alien to everything humans think they know about the natural world. And sometimes, late at night, Pete still hears that sound, half roar, half laughter, echoing through his dreams, reminding him that in Alaska's deepest wilderness, you're never really sure what's hunting what.
Alaska's aviation graveyards are filled with stories of pilots who pushed too far into weather they couldn't handle or took chances with mountains that don't forgive mistakes. But some disappearances can't be explained by mechanical failure or human error. Some vanish into clear skies under perfect conditions, leaving behind only radio transmissions that shouldn't be possible and wreckage that tells stories no accident investigator wants to believe. Flight 847 Delta was supposed to be routine, a medical supply run from Anchorage to the remote village of Bettles, carrying insulin and emergency medications that couldn't wait for the next scheduled delivery. The aircraft was a twin-engine Piper Navajo, well-maintained and equipped for Alaska's challenging conditions. At the controls was Captain Rick Moyer, a 26-year veteran of bush flying, with co-pilot Janet Kim, who'd been flying Alaska routes for 8 years. The flight plan called for a direct route across the Alaska Range, threading between peaks that Rick had navigated hundreds of times before. Weather was optimal: clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited, the kind of conditions that made Alaska flying look easy to anyone who didn't understand the state's capacity for sudden, violent changes. The last routine radio contact came at 14:32 hours, with Rick reporting normal flight conditions at 12,000 feet, approximately 40 minutes out from Bettles. Air traffic control acknowledged and cleared them for their approach. Everything was textbook standard. What happened next was captured by multiple radio receivers across central Alaska, creating a record that investigators would study for months without reaching any satisfactory conclusions. At 14:47, Rick's voice crackled through the static. "Anchorage Control, this is 847 Delta. We have unusual activity on the ground. Over." 847 Delta, Anchorage Control. "Clarify unusual activity. Over." A pause. Then Rick's voice again, strained and confused. "Control, we're seeing lights on the ground in formation patterns. Moving lights, geometric shapes. Not consistent with any known ground installations in this area." Janet Kim's voice came through the radio next, tight with concern. "There are dozens of them, Control. They're moving in coordinated patterns, like they're tracking us." 847 Delta, confirm your position and altitude. Position is, Christ, our GPS is malfunctioning, showing impossible coordinates. Altitude steady at 12,000, but the ground appears to be rising toward us. Air traffic controllers in Anchorage exchanged glances. GPS systems occasionally glitched in Alaska due to magnetic anomalies, but Rick Moyer was too experienced to be rattled by standard equipment problems. At 14:52, the transmissions became more urgent. "Control, 847 Delta. The lights are in the air now. Repeat, we have lights at our altitude, keeping pace with our aircraft." 847 Delta, are you reporting other aircraft in your vicinity? "Negative, Control. These aren't aircraft. They're just lights, moving independently. No visible means of propulsion. Janet, are you seeing this?" Janet's voice, barely controlled. "They're surrounding us, Rick. Count at least 20 objects, various sizes. They're maintaining formation around our aircraft." 847 Delta, can you maintain course and altitude? "We're trying, Control, but our instruments are going haywire. Compass is spinning. Altimeter readings are fluctuating. The lights are getting closer." What came next chilled every controller listening to the transmission. Rick's voice, no longer professional, edged with fear. "Control, they're not just lights. They're shapes inside them. Structures, like aircraft, but not any design I've ever seen."
The transmission cut to static for nearly 30 seconds. When Rick's voice returned, it was almost a whisper. "Control? Do you copy? We need immediate assistance. These things they're communicating with us somehow. Janet's saying she can hear them inside her head." Janet Kim's voice, dreamy and disconnected. "They want us to follow them. They're showing us things. Images of places that don't exist on any map. Control, my co-pilot is acting strangely. These lights seem to be affecting her somehow. I'm taking evasive action. 847 Delta, maintain current heading. We're scrambling rescue aircraft to your last known position." At 1458, Rick's transmission became desperate. "Control, the lights are inside our aircraft now. I don't know how, but they're passing through the fuselage like it's not there. Janet is not responding to commands. Her eyes are glowing." The static increased, punctuated by sounds that investigators would later describe as inconsistent with known aircraft operation, a low humming that seemed to pulse with rhythm, and underneath it, something that might have been voices speaking in harmonious but incomprehensible patterns. "Control, I can see them clearly now. They're not from here, not from anywhere on Earth. They want something from us, want us to go with them. Janet's already gone. She's still sitting here, but she's not Janet anymore." The final transmission from Flight 847 Delta came at 15:03. "Control, if anyone receives this, don't come looking for us. Whatever these things are, they're not hostile, but they're not letting us go either. They're taking us somewhere else, somewhere beyond the maps. Tell our families." The transmission ended in a burst of static that overloaded radio receivers across a 100-mile radius. Search and rescue operations began immediately, with aircraft and ground teams combing the Alaska range for any sign of the missing plane. What they found, scattered across 40 square miles of wilderness, defied explanation. Wreckage was located in pieces too small and too widely dispersed for any conventional crash scenario. The debris showed no signs of fire, explosion, or typical impact damage. Instead, the metal appeared to have been carefully disassembled, each component separated with surgical precision and arranged in geometric patterns across the mountainside. Most disturbing was the aircraft's black box, found intact, but containing only the recorded conversations between Rick and Janet during their final minutes, except their voices were overlaid with others speaking in languages that linguistics experts couldn't identify, using tonal patterns that seemed designed for vocal apparatus humans didn't possess. Rick Moyer and Janet Kim were never found. No blood, no personal effects, no trace of human remains anywhere in the wreckage field. It was as if they had simply vanished from inside their aircraft during flight. The official report classified the incident as aircraft breakup due to unknown atmospheric conditions, but the full radio transcripts were sealed under national security provisions. Flight 847 Delta became another entry in Alaska's long list of unexplained aviation mysteries. But on clear nights when atmospheric conditions are just right, radio operators across Alaska sometimes pick up fragments of transmission from Flight 847 Delta. Rick Moyer's voice calling out coordinates that don't correspond to any location on Earth, describing landscapes that exist beyond any map, forever flying through skies that belong to somewhere else entirely.
Nome, Alaska sits on the edge of the world, where the Bering Sea meets tundra that stretches unbroken to the horizon. It's a place where winter isn't just a season, it's a living force that shapes everything from architecture to psychology. But locals know that winter brings more than just cold and darkness. It brings her, the woman in white, who walks through blizzards like they're summer breezes, offering help to stranded travelers with a smile that promises salvation and delivers something else entirely. The first recorded sighting dates back to 1925, during the diphtheria epidemic, when dog sled teams raced serum to Nome through the worst blizzard in recorded history. Mushers reported seeing a tall woman in white walking alongside their teams during the worst stretches of the run,
keeping pace with dogs running at full speed, never seeming to touch the ground. But it was Tommy Kanguk who gave her a name and learned the price of accepting her help. Tommy was a subsistence hunter, born and raised in Nome, descended from generations of Inupiat who'd survived Arctic winters through knowledge passed down like precious inheritance. He understood snow conditions, could read weather patterns in cloud formations, knew which ice was safe and which would kill you. But even Tommy Kanguk, even someone with that much indigenous knowledge, could get caught by Alaska's capacity for sudden, murderous weather. It happened in February 2018, during what locals remember as the worst blizzard in decades. Tommy was checking his trapline 20 miles northeast of Nome when the storm hit with violence that transformed familiar landscape into an alien maze of white. Visibility dropped to 0 in minutes, wind speeds climbed past 60 miles per hour, and the temperature plummeted to 47 below. Tommy tried to make it back to his snow machine, but whiteout conditions made navigation impossible. Every direction looked identical. Every landmark vanished behind walls of driving snow. He was an experienced outdoorsman. He had emergency supplies, knew how to dig a survival shelter, understood the steps necessary to survive until the storm passed. But hypothermia was already setting in, and his fuel was running low. That's when he saw her, walking through the blizzard like it was a gentle snowfall. She was tall, taller than any woman Tommy had ever seen, with pale skin that seemed to glow against the storm's darkness. Her hair was white as fresh snow, flowing behind her despite the raging wind, and she wore a traditional-style parka that appeared to be made from fur so pure it hurt to look at directly. But it was her eyes that Tommy would remember until his dying day. They were completely white, no iris, no pupil, just blank whiteness that somehow conveyed infinite kindness and terrible hunger in the same gaze. "You're lost," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the howling wind. "You're cold. I can help you." Tommy's rational mind screamed warnings. No one could survive in this storm. No one could walk through 60-mile-per-hour winds like they were standing still. But hypothermia was affecting his judgment, and the woman's presence radiated warmth that his freezing body craved like an addiction. "Come with me," she said, extending a hand that looked normal except for fingernails that were too long, too sharp. Tommy reached for her hand and felt warmth flow up his arm like electric current. The cold receded, the pain of frostbite faded, and suddenly the storm didn't seem threatening anymore. With her touch, the blizzard became background noise, the wind felt gentle, and the snow transformed into something beautiful rather than lethal. She led him through the storm with sure steps, never hesitating, never checking direction. They walked for what felt like hours, but Tommy felt no fatigue, no discomfort. The woman's presence made everything easy, made survival effortless. They were walking towards something. Tommy could sense a destination ahead, a place of warmth and rest where the storm couldn't reach. But as they moved deeper into the blizzard, farther from any landmark he recognized, a small voice in the back of his mind began screaming warnings. This was wrong. The direction was wrong. The distance was impossible, and the woman herself was wrong in ways his conscious mind couldn't articulate, but his ancestral knowledge recognized with primal terror. Tommy stopped walking. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. The woman turned to face him, and for a moment, her kindly expression slipped. Behind the motherly smile, Tommy glimpsed something ancient and hungry, something that had been walking through Arctic storms since before humans learned to make fire. "Somewhere warm," she said, but now her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "You can't survive without me. The cold will take you. The storm will bury you. Come back with me and I'll make it easy." But Tommy was running, stumbling through chest-deep snow, following his own tracks back towards his snow machine. Behind him, the woman's voice followed like wind. "I'll find you again. When you're dying from cold, when you're lost and alone, I'll be there,
and next time you'll be grateful for my help." Tommy found his snow machine where he'd left it, covered in snow but functional. He made it back to Nome as the storm cleared, frostbitten and exhausted, but alive. The doctors treated his hypothermia, bandaged his frozen fingers, and released him with warnings about winter survival. But Tommy knew he hadn't survived through skill or luck. He'd been chosen by something that haunted Alaska's winters, something that fed on desperation and offered salvation that wasn't salvation at all. She still visits Nome during the worst storms, walking through blizzards that kill anyone foolish enough to travel in them. Search and rescue teams find her footprints sometimes, impossibly deep impressions in snow that should be too soft to hold any weight, leading away from abandoned vehicles towards destinations that don't appear on any map. The missing persons reports always follow the same pattern: experienced outdoorsmen, caught in sudden storms, last seen walking away from safety towards something only they could see. Their bodies are never recovered, but survivors, the few who escape her help, all describe the same thing: a beautiful woman in white who promises warmth and delivers something else entirely. Because in Alaska's deepest winter, when cold becomes a living thing that hunts human warmth, salvation and damnation can wear the same face and speak with the same gentle voice, offering help that comes with a price no living person should ever pay.
In rural Alaska, villages disappear sometimes. Not gradually, not due to economic decline or natural disaster, but suddenly, as if an entire community simply decided to walk away from their lives in the middle of an ordinary day. The official explanations vary: mass relocation, environmental hazards, communication breakdowns. But Sarah Koenig knows the truth about what happened to Anaktuvuk and why some places are better left empty. Sarah was a teacher with the Alaska Department of Education, assigned to provide supplemental instruction for remote villages where regular staffing proved impossible. It was challenging work, flying between settlements accessible only by bush plane, adapting curriculum to communities where traditional ways of life still held stronger than state requirements. But Sarah loved it, found purpose in connecting isolated children with the broader world of knowledge. Anaktuvuk was her final assignment of the 2019 school year, a small Inupiat village of 43 residents nestled in the Brooks Range, 200 miles from the nearest road. The community subsisted on hunting, fishing, and seasonal tourism, maintaining traditions that stretched back centuries while slowly adapting to modern necessities like satellite internet and solar power. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday in late October, flying in on a chartered Cessna that would return for her the following Monday. 5 days to assess the village's educational needs and establish distance learning protocols for the winter months ahead. The pilot, Jim Nakamura, had been making supply runs to Anaktuvuk for 15 years and knew every family by name. "Quiet bunch lately?" he mentioned as they circled the village for landing. "Radio check-ins have been spotty for weeks. Probably just equipment problems." From the air, Anaktuvuk looked perfectly normal. Smoke rising from chimneys, snowmobiles parked outside homes, children's sleds scattered in yards. But as they taxied to the small gravel strip that served as the village's airport, Sarah noticed an odd stillness to the scene, as if she were looking at a photograph rather than a living community. The village coordinator, Mary Tutu, was supposed to meet Sarah's plane, but no one appeared as she unloaded her bags. Jim seemed unconcerned. Schedules ran differently in Bush, Alaska, and weather often delayed planned meetings by hours or days. He helped Sarah carry her supplies to the village school, promised to check radio contact from Fairbanks, and took off into the overcast sky. Sarah found the school unlocked, which was unusual in communities where crime was virtually non-existent. The building was clean and well-maintained, with student artwork decorating the walls and lesson plans laid out on desks as if teachers had just stepped out for lunch. But the coffee in the pot was stone cold, and a thin layer of dust covered everything, not days' worth, but enough to suggest the building had been empty longer than expected. She walked through the village, looking for Mary or any of the 43 residents she was scheduled to meet. Front doors stood unlocked, windows glowed with electric light, and meals sat half-finished on kitchen tables, as if families had stepped away mid-bite and simply never returned. In the Tutu house, Sarah found pancakes still on the griddle, syrup congealed, but plates and silverware arranged for 4 people. Coffee cups sat full and untouched. A child's backpack lay open on the floor. Homework spilled out as if dropped in haste, but there were no signs of struggle, no indication of danger or emergency evacuation. House after house revealed the same pattern, lives interrupted in the middle of ordinary moments, but no evidence of where the people had gone. Beds were unmade, as if residents had risen normally that morning. Food was out, as if they'd been preparing breakfast when something called them away. But there were no footprints in the snow leading away from the village, no tire tracks or snowmobile trails indicating mass departure. As darkness fell, true Arctic darkness that comes early and stays late, Sarah barricaded herself in the school building, trying to rationalize what she'd found. Maybe the entire village had gone hunting together or traveled to another settlement for a community gathering. Remote Alaska operated by different rules, different social patterns that outsiders didn't always understand. But deep down, she knew something was fundamentally wrong with Inuktitut. Around midnight, Sarah heard the footsteps. They came from outside the school, circling the building with methodical precision. Not the random wandering of lost villagers, but a coordinated movement that suggested purpose and intelligence. Through the windows, she could see shapes moving in the darkness. Dozens of figures walking in perfect formation around the school, around and around in an endless loop. Sarah called out, identifying herself as the visiting teacher, explaining that she'd been looking for them all day. The figures stopped moving, but no one answered. In the silence that followed, she could hear breathing, not the natural rhythm of living humans, but something mechanical, synchronized, like a recorded sound played on repeat. She pressed her face to the window and tried to make out details in the darkness. The figures appeared to be the missing villagers. She recognized Mary's distinctive parka, saw the red snow boots that belonged to one of the children she was supposed to teach, but they stood too still, moved too uniformly, as if they'd forgotten how individual human motion worked. The circling continued until dawn, when the figures simply melted away into the landscape, leaving Sarah alone with questions that had no rational answers. When Jim's plane returned that afternoon, she was packed and waiting at the airstrip, desperate to leave Inuktitut behind. "Find everyone okay?" Jim asked as they lifted off. Sarah looked down at the village one last time. Smoke rose from chimneys, lights glowed in windows, and everything appeared normal from the air. But she knew better now, knew that the village was empty, that whatever walked those streets at night wasn't the community that once lived there. The official investigation found no evidence of foul play. The villagers' personal belongings remained untouched, their bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and aerial searches revealed no signs of mass migration. Inuktitut was classified as abandoned, its residents listed as missing persons in a case that remains active but inactive. But Sarah knows they didn't leave. She knows they're still there, walking in circles through their empty homes, going through the motions of lives they no longer remember how to live. Because sometimes in Alaska, entire communities don't disappear, they transform into something else, something that wears the shape of humanity while forgetting what it means to be human. And on clear nights, bush pilots flying over the Brooks Range still report seeing lights in Inuktitut, smoke from chimneys, signs of life in a village that's supposed to be empty, but none of them ever land to investigate. because they understand what Sarah learned that October night. Some places are too quiet, too still, too perfectly preserved to be safe for the living.